I never expected that a leaky ceiling and the threat of a ruined laptop would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It began with a persistent drip, a sound that grew from a minor annoyance into a full-blown crisis. And it ended with me understanding that sometimes the foundations of your life have to crack a little to let someone new in. Before all that, my life was a neatly organized collection of routines, predictable and safe, and I thought that was enough. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was a 27-year-old graphic designer, which is a profession that lends itself to a solitary existence. I worked from home, in a second-floor apartment that was my quiet sanctuary from the noise of the city. The space was minimalist, decorated in shades of gray and white, with everything in its proper place. My days followed a steady rhythm. Wake up, make coffee, work at my large desk by the window, a brief lunch, more work, then an evening spent sketching or losing myself in a movie. It was a life of quiet containment, and while it wasn't lonely, exactly, it had a certain echo to it, a feeling of empty space that I tried my best to ignore. I lived in a building that was old enough to have character, which was a polite way of saying it had quirks. The floors creaked, the pipes groaned, and the walls were thin enough that you learned the intimate details of your neighbors' lives whether you wanted to or not. For 2 years, my next-door neighbor had been a quiet, elderly woman who mostly kept to herself. But she had recently moved to be closer to her daughter, and her apartment had been taken over by him. His name was Caleb. I learned that from a misplaced piece of mail I'd picked up for him. He moved in on a Saturday, and the sounds of his arrival were anything but quiet. There was the heavy thud of furniture, the scrape of boxes across the floor, and the low murmur of his voice, deep and resonant, as he directed the movers. I caught a glimpse of him in the hallway that first day. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple gray t-shirt. His arms were corded with muscle, dusted with sawdust, and his dark hair was a mess of casual curls. He looked up, caught me staring, and gave me a brief, friendly nod. My heart did a ridiculous little jump, and I quickly ducked back inside my apartment, my cheeks warm. He was, in a word, intimidatingly handsome. He had the kind of easy, rugged confidence that I, with my anxious energy and preference for indoor activities, had always found both fascinating and completely out of reach. He seemed like the kind of guy who fixed his own truck, went camping on weekends, and drank beer with his buddies while watching football. I was the kind of guy who alphabetized his book collection and considered a trip to the art supply store a wild outing. We were from different worlds, or so I assumed. Over the next few weeks, my perception of him was built from small, sensory details. The faint, clean scent of cedarwood and sawdust that sometimes lingered in the hallway after he passed. The sound of quiet, methodical work coming from his apartment in the evenings, sanding, maybe, or carving. It wasn't loud or disruptive, but a gentle, industrious hum that I found strangely comforting. We exchanged polite greetings when we crossed paths, a "Hey, how's it going?" or a simple nod. He always had a small, genuine smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. Each brief interaction left me feeling a little flustered, a little more aware of the quiet hum of my own solitary life. He was a fixed point in my periphery, a warm and vibrant presence just on the other side of my wall. I told myself my interest was simple curiosity about a new neighbor. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. He represented a world of warmth and physicality that felt miles away from my own carefully curated digital life. He was a story I was watching unfold from a distance, never imagining for a second that I might become a part of its plot. He was just the handsome guy next door, a safe and distant object of admiration, and I was perfectly content to keep it that way. Or so I thought. The rain started on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a gentle spring shower. It was a relentless, hammering downpour that seemed determined to wash the city clean. I barely noticed it at first, lost in a complex design project, my headphones on, blocking out the world. The first sign of trouble was a faint, irregular tapping sound that managed to pierce through my music. I pulled my headphones off, annoyed, and listened. Drip, drip, drip. I scanned my ceiling. In the corner, directly above the desk where my entire professional life was stored on a sleek silver laptop, a dark, ugly water stain was beginning to bloom. And from the center of it, a single drop of water gathered, swelled, and fell, landing with a soft splash on my wooden floor. My blood ran cold. Another drop followed, then another, picking up speed. It was a slow-motion disaster unfolding right before my eyes. Panic seized me. I scrambled to unplug my laptop and monitor, hustling them to the safety of the kitchen counter. I grabbed a saucepan from the cupboard and slid it under the drip, the sound changing from a soft patter to a metallic plink. I stared at the spreading stain, my mind racing. I was a renter. I needed to call my landlord, but he was notoriously slow to respond to anything less than a 4-alarm fire. Water was now trickling down the wall, a tiny, destructive river heading for the power outlet. I didn't even know what to do first. My mind was a complete blank. Should I try to move my desk? Put down towels? I felt a wave of helpless frustration wash over me. It was in that moment of pure, unadulterated panic that I heard a knock on my door. It was firm and steady, a stark contrast to the frantic energy buzzing through me. I pulled the door open, ready to find a concerned neighbor from downstairs, but it was Caleb. He stood there, his brow furrowed with concern. He was wearing a simple Henley shirt, and his hands were tucked into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said, his voice calm. "I was just heading out and saw some water seeping under your door. Everything okay in here?" His gaze went past me, to the saucepan on the floor and the dark, menacing stain on my ceiling. "Oh," he said, a note of understanding in his voice. "That's not good." I just nodded, feeling a bit foolish. "It just started," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin. I don't really know what to do." I felt like a child admitting I couldn't solve a simple problem. I was supposed to be a capable adult, but faced with a bit of water, I had completely short-circuited. Caleb didn't laugh or look at me with pity. He just stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room and making it feel a little less chaotic. "All right, let's take a look," he said, his tone practical and reassuring. He walked over and studied the ceiling, his expression serious. "Yeah, that looks like it's coming from the roof. Probably found a weak spot in the flashing. You called your landlord?" I shook my head. "Just about to," I admitted. "Okay, well, first things first," he said, already taking charge. "We need to contain this." He looked around my apartment, his eyes landing on the tall plastic trash bin by my desk. "Let's use that. It'll hold more than a saucepan." Together, we swapped the pan for the bin, the drips now echoing with a hollow plastic thud. He then disappeared back into his own apartment for a moment and returned with a thick roll of duct tape and a plastic tarp. "Let's move your desk, just in case, and we can tape this up to try and funnel the water." I was struck by his immediate, capable response. While I had been frozen with indecision, he had assessed the situation and formulated a plan in seconds. We worked together, moving my heavy oak desk away from the wall. Our hands brushed a few times, and each brief contact sent a jolt of electricity through me. He was so close, the scent of cedar and something uniquely him filling my senses. It was distracting, to say the least. He expertly taped the tarp to the ceiling, creating a makeshift channel that directed the flow of water neatly into the bin. It was a temporary, ugly fix, but it was effective. The immediate crisis was averted. I finally took a breath, the adrenaline starting to subside. "Thank you," I said, my voice filled with genuine relief. Seriously, I was just standing here, panicking. He gave me a small, kind smile. "Don't worry about it. These old buildings, they have a mind of their own." He looked around at my displaced workspace, the tarp taped to the ceiling, and the steady drip into the bin. "You know," he said, his tone turning thoughtful, "you probably shouldn't stay here tonight. That plaster is soaked. It could come down, and with the water running down the wall near the outlet, it's not safe." He was right. The thought of sleeping in the room with a chunk of wet plaster dangling over my head was unsettling. But I had nowhere else to go. All my friends lived across town, and it was too late to impose on anyone. "I don't really have a choice," I said with a sigh, already picturing a long, sleepless night on my living room couch. Caleb hesitated for just a second, a flicker of something I couldn't read in his eyes. Then he said, "Actually, you do. I have a spare room. It's not much, just a bed and a dresser, but it's clean and dry. You could stay with me until your landlord gets this sorted out." He said it so casually, as if offering up his home to a near stranger was the most natural thing in the world. I was floored. The offer hung in the air between us, a lifeline I hadn't expected. My mind raced. weighing the awkwardness of accepting against the genuine risk of staying. But looking at his open, sincere expression, the decision felt surprisingly easy. It was an emergency, after all. A practical solution to a practical problem. That's what I told myself, anyway. Are you sure? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I wouldn't want to intrude. It's no intrusion at all, he insisted. What are neighbors for? Go grab your stuff. I'll make us some tea. And just like that, the solid, predictable walls of my life had crumbled, and I was about to step into his. I packed a small overnight bag with a sense of dreamlike disbelief. Toiletries, a change of clothes, my laptop, the essentials. Every part of me was vibrating with a nervous energy. This was happening. I was going to be staying in Caleb's apartment. I was going to see past the closed door and into the life of the man who had occupied so much of my quiet speculation. My carefully constructed boundary between observation and interaction had been washed away by a simple leak. When I knocked on his door a few minutes later, bag in hand, he welcomed me in with another one of those easy smiles. His apartment was, in many ways, the complete opposite of mine. Where my home was cool tones and sharp lines, his was warm woods and soft textures. The air smelled richly of sawdust, old books, and brewing tea. Handmade wooden bookshelves lined one wall, overflowing with a chaotic mix of novels, poetry, and technical manuals on carpentry. The furniture was sturdy and well-worn, and a half-finished wooden chair sat in a corner, surrounded by a neat array of tools. It was a space that felt lived in, comfortable, and deeply personal. Here, let me show you the room, he said, leading me down a short hallway. The spare room was simple, just as he'd described, but it was welcoming. A comfortable-looking bed with a dark blue comforter, a solid oak dresser that he had clearly made himself, and a small window looking out onto the rain-slicked street. The bathroom is just across the hall. Make yourself at home, seriously. I dropped my bag on the floor, my heart still beating a little too fast. This was real. I was standing in his home, surrounded by the tangible evidence of his life. It felt incredibly intimate. Back in the living room, he handed me a steaming mug of tea. I took a sip. It was perfect, strong, with a splash of milk and just a hint of honey. It was exactly how I made it for myself every single morning. I looked at him, surprised. How did you know? I asked, gesturing with the mug. He just shrugged, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. I've seen you get coffee at that little place down the street a few times, he admitted. You always order the same thing. Figured your tea would be similar, my mind reeled. He had been noticing me, too. He had been paying attention to the small details of my life, just as I had been with his. The realization sent a warm, pleasant shock through my system, settling deep in my chest. It was a small thing, a cup of tea, but it felt significant. It felt like a message. We sat on his comfortable couch, the sound of the rain against the window a soft drumming in the background. The initial awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by an easy conversation. I had assumed we would have nothing in common, but I was wrong. We talked about books. It turned out we both had a love for old science fiction. He asked me about my graphic design work, and his questions were insightful and genuinely curious. He wasn't just making polite conversation. He was actually interested. In return, I learned about him. He was a custom furniture maker, a passion he'd turned into a career after years of working in construction. He spoke about wood with a reverence that I usually reserved for fonts and color palettes. He described the grain of a piece of cherry wood as if he were describing a lover's face. He was articulate and passionate, and the more he talked, the more the image I had of him, the rugged, unapproachable guy, crumbled away, replaced by someone much more complex and interesting. Later in the evening, he pulled out a worn acoustic guitar. I hope you don't mind, he said, almost shyly. It helps me unwind. I shook my head, completely captivated. He began to play, not singing, just letting the melody fill the room. His fingers, which I had only seen as strong and capable, moved over the fretboard with a surprising delicacy. The music was gentle and melancholic, a stark contrast to his confident exterior. It was in that moment, watching him play, his eyes closed in concentration, that I saw a crack in his armor. This wasn't just a tough guy who built things with his hands. There was a deep well of sensitivity in him, an artistic soul that he kept hidden just beneath the surface. It was a revelation that made him seem suddenly, breathtakingly real. It was no longer just his physical presence that drew me in. It was this glimpse of his hidden vulnerability, the quiet, thoughtful man behind the sawdust and strong hands. The distance I had always felt between us was shrinking with every note he played. My fascination was quickly turning into something deeper, something that felt a lot like hope. The next morning, I woke up in a strange bed, the light filtering in through an unfamiliar window. For a moment, I was disoriented, and then the events of the previous night came rushing back. The leak, the panic, and Caleb. I was in Caleb's spare room. I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and bacon wafting down the hall. It felt surprisingly domestic, and a part of me, a part one had long kept dormant, wished this was my reality every morning. I got dressed and went into the living area, feeling a little shy. Caleb was at the stove, a spatula in hand, humming along to a song on the radio. He turned and smiled when he saw me. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Coffee's ready. How do you like your eggs?" The casual intimacy of the question made my stomach flutter. This was so far beyond polite neighborly duty. He was treating me like a welcome guest, like a friend. We ate breakfast together at his small wooden dining table. The landlord had called him back. Since Caleb's name was also on the lease for the building, the landlord actually responded, and a roofer was scheduled to come that afternoon. The ceiling in my apartment would need some plaster work, so it would be another day or two before I could move back in. "So, you're stuck with me for a little longer," Caleb said with a playful grin that made my heart skip a beat. I found that I didn't mind at all. In fact, the thought of returning to my empty, quiet apartment was suddenly much less appealing than it had been 2 days ago. That afternoon, with the roofers making a racket next door, we found ourselves with time to kill. "I need to organize some lumber in the workshop downstairs," Caleb said. "It's a 2-person job to move some of the bigger planks. Do you mind giving me a hand?" Eager for a distraction and a chance to spend more time with him, I readily agreed. The workshop was in the basement of the building, a large, well-lit space that smelled intensely of pine and machine oil. It was Caleb's sanctuary, filled with impressive-looking saws, sanders, and stacks of beautiful wood. It was here, in the heart of his world, that the moment happened. It was something so small, so insignificant on the surface, but it changed everything between us. We were moving a long, heavy slab of dark walnut. It was awkward to handle, and as I shifted my grip, my hand slid along the rough, unfinished edge. A sharp, stinging pain shot through my palm. "Ow!" I yelped, pulling my hand back instinctively. I looked down and saw it. A tiny, dark sliver of wood embedded deep in the soft flesh of my hand. It wasn't a serious injury, just a nuisance, but it throbbed with a surprising intensity. Caleb immediately stopped what he was doing. "You okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. He gently took my hand to inspect the damage. His touch was warm and firm, and my breath hitched in my throat. The entire world seemed to shrink down to the feeling of his thumb stroking gently against my skin as he examined the tiny wound. "That's a nasty one," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "It's in there deep. We need to get that out before it gets infected." He led me over to a well-lit workbench and had me sit on a tall stool. "Stay here," he commanded softly. He washed his hands meticulously at a utility sink and then returned with a small first aid kit. From it, he produced a pair of fine-tipped tweezers and a small antiseptic wipe. My heart was pounding in my chest, a frantic, pulsing rhythm that matched the throbbing in my palm. This felt impossibly intimate, far more so than sharing breakfast or sleeping under his roof. "All right," he said, his voice low and steady as he pulled another stool up to face me, our knees almost touching. "This might sting a little. Just try to hold still." He took my hand in his again, his grip surprisingly gentle for someone with such calloused, strong hands. He held it securely, cradling my palm in his, as if it were something precious. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the intense focus in his eyes as he leaned in close. The air grew thick and heavy. I could smell the faint scent of his soap mixed with the ever-present aroma of sawdust. I watched his face, the slight furrow of his brow, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheeks. He was so close I could feel his breath on my skin. He dabbed the area with the cold, sharp-smelling antiseptic wipe, and I flinched. "Sorry," he whispered, his eyes flicking up to meet mine for a brief, charged second before returning to his task. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, He began to work at the splinter with the tweezers. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity. My entire consciousness was focused on the point of contact between us, the solid weight of his hand supporting mine, the delicate pressure of the tweezers, the way his thumb rested on my wrist, his pulse a steady, calming beat against my own frantic one. I wasn't breathing. I had forgotten how. He worked in complete silence, his concentration absolute. And in that silence, a new awareness bloomed between us. This wasn't just a simple act of first aid. It was an act of profound care. The tenderness with which he held me, the focused intensity of his gaze, the soft reassurances he murmured whenever I winced, it all spoke a language much louder than words. It felt like he was tending to something more than just a splinter. It felt like he was tending to me. Finally, with a last, careful pull, he extracted the tiny sliver of wood. "Got it," he said, his voice a soft rumble. He held it up for me to see before dropping it onto the workbench. He cleaned the small wound again, his touch lingering, and then carefully applied a small, neat bandage. He didn't let go of my hand right away. He just held it for a moment longer, his thumb stroking softly over the back of my knuckles. He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine, and the air crackled with everything that had been left unsaid between us. His gaze was searching, questioning, and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name, but it made my stomach swoop. The workshop, with its loud saws and stacks of wood, felt as quiet and sacred as a church. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. The line between neighbor and friend, between kindness and something more, had been irrevocably blurred. He finally let go of my hand, and the loss of his touch felt like a physical ache. The turning point had come and gone, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unspoken tension. We finished organizing the lumber, the earlier ease between us replaced by a new, charged carefulness. We were acutely aware of each other, navigating the space around us as if it were laden with invisible tripwires. Every accidental brush of our arms, every shared glance, felt magnified and significant. The air was thick with questions that neither of us dared to ask. I retreated to the quiet of the spare room, my hand throbbing with a phantom ache. But the real ache was in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying the scene in the workshop over and over in my mind. It was an endless loop of analysis. The way he held my hand, so gently. The look in his eyes when he finished, a look that was so much more than simple concern. Was I imagining it? Was I projecting my own burgeoning feelings onto an act of simple, neighborly kindness? My mind became a battleground between hope and fear. Hope was a fragile, fluttering thing, insisting that the intimacy of that moment was real, that the connection I felt was mutual. It whispered that the way he looked at me, the way he'd remembered how I took my tea, the shyness he showed when he played his guitar, it all added up to something more. It was a beautiful, terrifying thought. But fear was a much louder, more insistent voice. It was the voice of reason, of self-protection. It told me I was a fool, reading too much into things. Caleb was just a genuinely nice guy. That's all. He would do the same for anyone. He was probably straight, and I was just a temporary inconvenience he was being kind to. The fear warned me that if I let myself believe in that fragile hope, I was setting myself up for a crushing disappointment. Rejection was a familiar pain, and my mind was trying to shield me from it by dousing the hopeful sparks before they could catch fire. That evening, we ordered a pizza, the easy conversation from the night before now gone. We ate mostly in silence, the space between us on the couch feeling like a vast chasm. The television played, but I couldn't have told you what was on. All of my senses were focused on him, on the subtle shifts in his posture, the way he avoided my eyes. He seemed just as lost in thought as I was, his brow occasionally furrowed in concentration. Was he replaying the moment, too? Or was he just wondering when he could have his apartment back to himself? When my landlord called to say the repairs were done, and I could move back in the next morning, the news landed with a thud in my stomach. A part of me was relieved. The tension was becoming unbearable, and returning to the familiarity of my own space felt like a retreat to safe ground. But a much larger part of me was filled with a profound sense of loss. This strange, intimate interlude was over. I would go back to my apartment, and he would be in his, and the wall between us would be back in place, thicker and more imposing than ever before. I packed my bag slowly that night, each item I placed inside feeling like a step back toward my old, solitary life. The hope that had bloomed so brightly just hours before was now wilting under the weight of my anxiety. I had been given a glimpse of a different kind of life, a life filled with warmth, easy companionship, and the startling intimacy of a shared glance. And now it was being taken away. I convinced myself it was for the best. It was better to retreat now than to make a fool of myself, to misread the signals and shatter the fragile friendship we had managed to build. I would thank him profusely, move back into my apartment, and we would go back to being polite, distant neighbors. It was the safe, sensible thing to do. It was also the most heartbreaking. The next morning, I stood at his door with my bag in hand, a carefully rehearsed speech of gratitude on my lips. My heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. This was it, the end of our brief, strange time together. I took a deep breath, steeling myself to say goodbye and walk away, to lock my feelings back up where they couldn't hurt me. He opened the door, and the look on his face stopped me cold. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his expression was a mixture of exhaustion and turmoil. My prepared speech died in my throat. He looked at my bag, then back at my face, and a muscle in his jaw clenched. "Lucas, wait," he said, his voice rough. Don't go yet. Can we talk for a minute?" My heart, which had been sinking, suddenly shot into my throat. I nodded mutely and followed him back to the living room. I put my bag down by the door, a silent testament to my intended departure. We stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, the space between us humming with nervous energy. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of his own anxiety. "Look," he started, then stopped, letting out a frustrated sigh. "I'm not very good at this." He finally met my eyes, his gaze direct and intense. "This whole situation, it wasn't just about your leaky ceiling." I just stared at him, my mind trying to process his words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He took a step closer, closing some of the distance between us. "The leak was real," he clarified quickly, "but me offering you a place to stay, that was selfish. I've been wanting to get to know you since the day I moved in. I'd see you in the hall or coming back from that coffee shop, and you just, I don't know. You seemed quiet and kind, and there was something about you. But I'm awkward. I didn't know what to say. The leak just felt like an excuse. An opportunity." A wave of dizziness washed over me as his confession sank in. He had been noticing me. He had been feeling something, too. The hope I had tried so hard to extinguish roared back to life, bright and overwhelming. I felt it, too. I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. I thought I was imagining things. Especially yesterday. In the workshop, a look of profound relief washed over his face. "Yesterday," he breathed, taking another step closer. "We were only inches apart now. I was trying so hard to keep it together. When I was holding your hand. Lucas, he trailed off, searching for the right words. "I haven't felt that way about anyone in a very long time." My own confession tumbled out before I could stop it. "I haven't either," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "To be honest, I was terrified you were just being nice, and I was making everything up in my head." A small, genuine smile touched his lips. It was the first real smile I'd seen from him all morning, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "No," he said softly. "You weren't making anything up." And then, he closed the final gap between us. He raised his hand, not to my injured palm this time, but to my face. His fingers were warm as they gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my cheek. My eyes fluttered shut at the contact. It was a gesture so tender, so full of unspoken feeling, that it made me want to cry with relief. "Can I?" he whispered, his voice a low vibration that I felt more than heard. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, opening my eyes to see his face, so close to mine, his expression open and vulnerable. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away, and then his lips met mine. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of relief, of mutual acknowledgement. It was firm and warm, and tasted faintly of coffee and a confession that had been held back for far too long. All the anxiety, all the fear, all the unspoken tension of the past 2 days melted away in that one moment of connection. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, and kissed him back with all the hope and longing I had kept locked inside. It felt like coming home. That kiss wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. I didn't move back into my apartment that day. Instead, I left my bag by the door and stayed. We spent the rest of the day talking, really talking, laying all of our cards on the table. We unraveled the months of silent observation, the near misses in the hallway, the small moments that had meant so much to both of us. It was like finding the missing half of a story I had only been able to read in pieces. In the weeks and months that followed, the wall between our apartments became irrelevant. We were a constant presence in each other's lives. My minimalist gray apartment was slowly invaded by the warmth of his world. A handcrafted wooden bowl on my coffee table, the lingering scent of cedar from his jacket, the sound of his guitar drifting through my open door. His space, in turn, softened with my presence. My sketches were pinned to his corkboard, my favorite books found their way onto his shelves, and my laptop was often set up on his dining table as we worked in comfortable silence. We learned the rhythms of each other's lives. I learned that he hummed when he was concentrating on a difficult piece of woodwork, and he learned that I needed 2 cups of coffee before I could form a coherent sentence in the morning. We went on dates to art galleries and long walks in the woods. He would explain the different types of trees, and I would explain the principles of color theory. We found a beautiful harmony in our differences. Our relationship was built on the foundation of those first few days, on kindness, on care, and on a vulnerability that we had both been afraid to show. The memory of him carefully removing the splinter from my hand became a cherished touchstone for us. It was a symbol of how he had so gently and patiently removed the splinters of fear and loneliness from my heart. Sometimes, when we were sitting on the couch, he would take my hand and trace the tiny, faded scar on my palm with his thumb, and we would both smile, no words needed. One evening, a few months later, another rainstorm rolled in, drumming against the windows of Caleb's apartment. I was curled up on the couch, reading, while he was sketching out a design for a new project. The sound of the rain, which had once been a source of panic, was now just a soothing backdrop to our quiet life together. He looked up from his notepad and caught my eye, a soft, contented smile on his face. He didn't have to say anything. I knew we were both thinking the same thing. I never did fix the small water stain on my ceiling. It remained there, a faint, ghostly map of the disaster that had brought us together. I looked at it not as a flaw, but as a reminder that my world wasn't as contained as I thought, and that my heart wasn't as guarded as I had pretended. It's funny how a disaster, a tiny crack in the ceiling, can end up being the very thing that saves you. It doesn't just let the water in. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it lets the light in, too.